Hello, everyone. Welcome to another webinar. Today, we're going to be doing something really special and really interesting. We're going to talk about integrating NetBox as a source of truth for network automation. And if that wasn't good enough, we've got something extra special. I actually have a guest here to join me as a co-presenter, Mr. Jordan Villarreal, and is here to help me and have a dialogue and conversation. Of course, I am Rich Martin, Senior Technical Marketing Engineer at Itential. And Jordan, welcome to the webinar, and give us a little
Awesome.
background
Thanks,
on
Rich.
yourself.
Thanks for setting me up there. I'm really looking forward to our chat. So, my name is Jordan Villarreal. Hi. I'm technical advocate for NetBox at NS1. I've been a network engineer for the past 22 years, and it's kind of my job to have conversations about NetBox. Just to understand how engineers use it out in the community, how we can help them use it better, what features they're looking for, different things like that. So yeah, my job is to talk about NetBox generally, and that's what I'm hoping to bring into our chat today.
Well, I'm excited about that because all I get to talk about is automation. So I think combining our two superpowers, this is going to be really
I think we have
useful.
good overlap.
Um, but that being said, yeah, no, that being said, I do want to thank you for coming. And in full disclosure, you've never clicked anything in
That
our
is
platform.
very
Is that correct?
correct. And so as a network engineer, I've been aware of iTential, but had never really had an opportunity to play with it. The organizations that I had previously been at weren't very automation forward or automation. They were maybe automation curious is the way to describe them at best. So I have
Okay.
a cursory
Yeah.
awareness of iTential, and after we set this up, I
Good.
purposely avoided it. I'm not gonna look at any docs. I'm just going to stick with the knowledge that I have and jump into this relatively
Okay.
blind.
Oh, well, fantastic. I'm glad that that's the approach you're taking, because now that I have a live captive audience as part of this, I am going to endeavor to teach you. So not only do we want to show NetBox as a source of truth and all the, and at least one of the foundational use cases that we run into all the time when we talk to our customers and prospects about what they want to automate, NetBox always comes up. But also helping for you to understand how to automate in our platform. So how that all fits together.
Excellent.
All right, well, let's continue down the road here. We always start off with kind of an overview of the points that we'll be covering. So in this demo today, point one, we want to take a look at NetBox's API documentation. I'm gonna throw some kudos over to the next NetBox team. As far as API documentation, structure, all that goes, top notch. And we see a lot of APIs here at Itential because we do, and we're going to show you the integration techniques that we have, but we do a lot, everything we do is API first, right? You integrate into our platform for API. So we see a lot of good API implementations. We see a lot of, let's just say, not so good API implementations. And we think NetBox is
Well, I
really
mean,
good.
definitely thank you for that. And we do hear that from a lot of different places. We've heard it. Probably the biggest name that we've heard it from is Cisco, from their developers. That the overall way the API has been put together makes a lot of sense. So it does me a lot of good to hear that you've seen that as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So along with that, this is kind of, it's kind of a stepwise flow. So let's take a look at the API, investigate it a little bit. And then how do we get that API into our system so we can start using those APIs as API calls as automation steps, right? So that next point is creating an integration in Itential, and we take a very clever and unique way of doing integrations to make it very easy, especially when the APIs are well documented according to a standard like Swagger, Open API. So I'll show you how to do that. And then once we have an integration onboarded into our platform, then we can start building a workflow and leveraging those API calls, right? And so of course, and I think you would agree that IP address management is probably the number one thing we run into. I know NetBox has a lot of features and functionalities, very flexible, but one of the first things that always comes up is, hey, we're using NetBox to do our our IP address management. We moved off of spreadsheets.
Yeah, we definitely hear a lot of that.
And Yeah, yeah. And so how do you automate that? How do you automate that process? So we'll go through that. And how about this one? And I always love talking to network practitioners about data transformation, because when I say data transformation, they go, well, what are you talking about? But it is an inherent skill that every network engineer does. So for instance, Jordan, we're gonna pull an IP address, right? We just want to get the next available IP address for this certain part of the network, but I need to configure it on a device, right? So how do I? Is it a one-to-one mapping correlation, or do I have to do something in between, right? So even if I go from a spreadsheet and pull the IP, in order for us to do a CLI, what's the process there?
Right. Yeah. That's pretty that that comports with reality. That is very common things.
Yeah. So I always say network engineers, experts at data transformation. They just need to automate that process. And so that's one of the techniques that we have and features of our platform is allowing folks to build data transformations that are reusable and flexible, so that as you continue to build your automations out, you can reuse those things and add more to them. And we're gonna show you that as well. And then finally, we got to automate those network changes. We're going to use NetBox as a source of truth. We're going to use a form as a second source of truth, because we'll find that all the data, at least for our demonstration here, isn't coming straight from NetBox. We also need some additional data. It could come from NetBox. It could come from a database. Again, part of what we do at Itential is to automate network changes and network updates, but also to integrate all the systems that data comes from. So I would say number one and number two, Jordan, uh, integrations from our customers and our prospects is ServiceNow and NetBox. So I figured let's throw those
Yeah,
two
I think
things in
that's
here
great. I
together.
mean, just again, coming back from actually the last position that I was at, we used ServiceNow, and I don't know exactly where we're going inside of ServiceNow, but change management was always a big thing. And then ServiceNow has its
Yeah.
own CMDB where they keep track of assets, which is where change management would pull from. So a way to bring the NetBox data into ServiceNow for ServiceNow enabled features, that I mean, that's going to be phenomenal. That's going to meet the needs of people outside of the engineering teams, like change management boards, just upper management. I love that. I can't wait to see that.
Yeah, yeah, no, and in fact, previous to doing this one with you, this webinar with you, I did a 4-part series on the kind of like how to integrate ServiceNow with our platform and use them in network automations, where we actually unpack all of those different features that you just talked about. And one of the things that you can do is self-service through ServiceNow, leveraging automation in our platform. So all of that is possible because
Oh,
of the way we
beautiful.
do integrations. All right. So next, I just want to give a general demo overflow. I mean, overview of the workflow. There we go, and talk about the different steps we'll be accomplishing today in our demo. So number one of the things we will do is we'll get input from a form. That just makes it easy for demonstration purposes. That form is just like any other form you would fill out, whether it's in NetBox or in our platform. In our platform, we make it easy to build a form, to create a form. But that form information, like I said, could come from another application that has self-service capabilities like ServiceNow. After that, we're going to also have a step where we get the IP address from NetBox. And Jordan, I take these first two steps. There's always a data gathering portion of an automation, or even just a manual
Right.
process, right? Where we need to gather the data from the different sources in order for us to even make a network change. So I always kind of compartmentalize that in my head, like where are all the sources we need to
Right.
gather
Yeah.
data
Okay.
from.
That makes sense. I mean, it would be nice if NetBox was literally everything, but I know that it can't be. So yeah, you've got to pull from what you need.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think NetBox can do a whole lot. We're only touching a little bit of it here, but presumably the data that we get from a form could come from NetBox, right? So we're not stopping that at all. But it's always good for us, from our perspective, is to show, hey, whether it's coming from a single source or multiple sources, we have the ability to integrate
Okay.
those things.
Cool.
That's part of what we do. After that, here's another process that everybody's probably familiar with. Before you make a network change, I have to open a change request ticket.
Yes. Oh yeah.
um, yeah, and then where does that data come from for the change request ticket? So opening the ticket's easy. Populating the ticket, right, is kind of the next thing. And so there's kind of another data gathering process that has to happen. And before that occurs I'm going to show you how data transformation allows us to gather that data from the forum, gather that data from NetBox, use it not only for a network change, which is kind of that middle step, but also how we can leverage that same information, transform it so that it can be used in ServiceNow
Right.
to update the ticket. And this goes to updating ticket documentation, right? Work notes, things like that. The things that often get forgotten, but it
Oh
really
yeah,
ought to be
and
there.
that's I really like the way that this flows, looking like how we're stacking this together. Because on that last point there, when you can automate little things that have a tendency to get lost along the way, like did you update that? Did you put it in the right status? At the very end, did you even close it? Anything that can help an engineer walk this path more easily, that's phenomenal.
Great, great. Yep. So then we'll verify the change manually. This could be automated as well, but for our purposes, it's good. Things operate so quickly in an automation, you kind of have to have a pause
Yep.
for us to take a look at what's going on. So we'll do that. And then finally, like you just said, closing the ticket out. Um, and so last point of this on this slide before we enter into the demonstration itself is in the world of network engineering, especially like earlier you said from the organization you came from, they were network automation curious, right? They're kind of just getting
Right.
started in that journey. And a lot of times that very central box right there, make the network change, is typically the first thing network practitioners, engineers, and networking teams start to look at. How do I automate? Like I have this backlog. It's a it's a very repetitive process. How
Yep.
do I automate that? Right. And whether it's Python or Ansible or whatever tooling they want to use, that's typically where they start. Right. So they go from the investigative phase of automation to saying, hey, we'll pick this task
Right.
and now we're
Yeah,
automating.
and I can actually say that's loosely what the stage that I was in. It was, well, I have a
Mhm.
repeatable task, and it was our SNMP control wasn't quite what it should be. Neither was the like the configuration storage. So I didn't have a good
Mhm.
repository that I could go to and say, all right, well, here are the SNMP strings, and here's where it's right, and here's where it's wrong. So that actually started my automation journey, which was a Python script to just check what SNMP strings a list of devices would respond to. And that was kind
Mm.
of like I never really got it to scale much higher. But everyone that I've talked to about automation, they always say, let's start with a use case, automate through your use case, and then keep growing.
Right. Absolutely. Yep. That's precisely where most of our customers start with that kind of scenario. So, especially if we're working
Right.
with the networking team. So what we always want to show them is, yes, here's how you accomplish that network automation that you're focused on as the world of automation. But but like we're showing here, what about the steps before and
Yeah,
what
and
about
I
the
think
steps
that's
after?
and that's kind of that point is after you've made that leap and that you're starting to think more, how do I operationalize? How do I work this into
Right.
a business flow? How do I make it repeatable so that other engineers can interact with it as well? That was the sort of the threshold that I was approaching. It's okay, I can do some stuff, but how do I make it real? How do I automate the
Right.
automation so that it's repeatable for somebody else to do?
Great. Well, that's great. So I expect more questions and dialogue as we continue. So let me share my screen
Yes.
now and let's get started. All right. So we're going to start with NetBox because that's really what the focus is here today. Um, so let me show you the integration process because I want you to
Okay.
think of this in stages, right? In order for us to automate NetBox, um, we need to be able to integrate it into our system, to the Itential platform. What does that process look like? And once we integrate it into our system, then we have these API calls that that we've talked about earlier that are accessible to us. So let's start at the very beginning. So what I'm looking at is actually a NetBox 3.2 install that you were so kind to help furnish
Sure.
for us for this demonstration. And I want to show the process of integrating this into our platform. I won't go through the whole process because I've already integrated it, but I'll show you basically the steps it takes and how easy it can be when you have API documentation like NetBox has that makes it easy when it's standards based like Open API or Swagger. This is the demo that you set up for us, and I think this is true. But for every API or for every NetBox URL that we've used here internally, if I go to /API/docs of that main URL, it's going to take me to this right here, this beautiful thing right here, the API
Yeah,
documentation.
I'm nearly certain that's the case. Typically, the way that I get to it on the main page, there's a link at the very bottom that lets you jump over to it. So,
Okay.
yeah, you can get to it this way. But then I think it's the lower left, lower right hand corner. There's a URL that'll jump you over to this as well.
Oh, hey, you're teaching me stuff. That's awesome.
You bet.
Appreciate that. Um, but what this gives us is not only a listing of all, and this is what we were talking about before. All of these API calls are available, um, through the NetBox API. So it's very, very deep in all of the things you can do, which is great from our perspective in the automation as an automation platform, because once we integrate this, all of these things become available
Right.
as kind of drag and drop tasks on a canvas. So we love to see the depth of this because it gives our customers the opportunity to basically do whatever they need to do as they build their automation. So for instance, today we're just essentially reserving an IP, right, or allocating an IP. But you know, if you're spinning something up in the network, well, there are gonna be
Right.
times where you spin it down, right? So you can also there are API calls here to you know give the IP address back and say, hey, we're no
So let's
longer
say
using it.
from an engineer standpoint, like, okay, I want to bridge Itential and NetBox together. And I have no doubt that Itential has put sort of that, not necessarily the logic, but I don't have to understand how the API necessarily works. How deep do I have to understand the API? Like, do I need to understand the difference between a get, a post, a put, a patch? Or even like down to some of the requirements for each of those, like some are required fields, some aren't. Is that built into
Yeah.
Itential's logic? Do I have to put that logic in?
Well, I will definitely step you through that, but this is a great point. So having something like NetBox available, all of the parameters, all of the requirements, all of those things that you just talked about, and which API calls you have to, you use for certain things comes from the documentation. So the better the documentation of the underlying system, that's where we pull
Okay.
all of that from, right? So you'll see in a moment. A lot of that is already defined. A lot of that documentation, if it's inside the API, the Open API spec that NetBox has here, then it becomes usable in our platform. Now, that being said, you still need to know what certain calls,
Oh,
what their
sure.
functions are, right? And that becomes useful when again, I think NetBox falls into this category of having human readable API documentation with examples that are available as well. And so ServiceNow does a great job, NetBox does a great job, AWS has a great job where you have these examples that give you the primitive API calls that you need to do certain things. But that's universally because while the API standards can be defined by like Swagger, Open API, Postman collections, things like that. It's really up to the particular vendor to install all of the different calls, but then document them
Right.
in other formats, right? In actual human readable documentation that says, here's a call and this is what it does. And here's some
Okay.
examples of how
So
to
then
use it.
just by sheer proxy of the fact that the Swagger, that the documentation here is ingestible in that open API format, I don't have to understand how each API call works. Obviously, I have to understand what it does. Like if it's
Right.
pulling an IP. Like I have to logically understand how an IP is pulled and extracted, or but I don't need
Correct.
to know all of the underlying, like the way that the query needs to be structured or anything like that. That's
Absolutely right. Yeah, we handle those details for sure. And to answer that, how those things particularly work, going back to this particular site here, clicking on any of these gives you the ability to try it out and test it, right? So you can actually go through and learn how each one of these API calls works within the NetBox platform itself, and determine and then take that information and that knowledge and say, okay, now that I know exactly how that works, I can apply that same information to the
right.
API calls that are in Itential's platforms as well. So that's a great way to investigate the API calls in NetBox
Okay,
and
yeah,
test them
and
out.
I mean, I've obviously I know the Swagger side pretty well. I mean, I play with it quite frequently,
Mhm.
so I'm familiar with how to walk through there and how it's structured out. But the idea that iTential can sort of take that knowledge, that structured documentation, and ingest it. That I like the idea of saving time with that. That I, I don't have to put that together.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, so I popped us over to our platform. So there's an area in our platform called Admin Essentials. This is where you onboard different integrations. We have a couple of way of onboarding systems, right? We have something called adapters. So if we have an entire library of pre-built um, assets, some of them are adapters. And adapter is, so you can think of it as an integration that we publish, we Itential publish, right? That's great that we do that, but at the same time, we want to give our customers the opportunity to generate their own system integrations without us, without being beholden to us. And that's where this whole concept of using standards like Open API Swagger becomes very, very useful to our customers, because if there's a published document for their API, this is where we can consume it, ingest it into the system, and you don't have to wait for us to generate an integration or an adapter for you. So you have different options. So we already have an adapter that we've onboarded for NetBox. In fact, we've got two here because we have two older versions. But let's go through the process of integrating that 3.2 that we just showed. So if I go here to import, essentially the first step I'll do is I'll create an integration model. That is the JSON file that we can download. In fact, if I clicked on here, I won't do it, but if I clicked on here and save that file, it's going to give me a JSON file that is the documentation for the API spec. And once I have that saved, I can just click here. I've got it saved here. It's going to read it in, and then it's going to validate it because it's in a JSON format. And I would definitely recommend, I've got other webinars where I do an entire conversation around JSON transformation, JSON schema, JSON objects, things like that. But one of the great things about JSON is it's central to our platform. We represent data internally, data input, data output through JSON. JSON is simply a textual format to represent data. It's very flexible, but also you couple it with something called JSON schema, which provides the strict definition of what that data format should look like. And then an object is based off of the schema, and it should match the schema, but it also contains the data itself. And so that's what we're doing here. So the Open API spec that we've just gotten from NetBox is in a JSON format, has the schema defined. And because we can validate it, we can check that internally using that schema to ensure that the entire model is valid before we create a true integration for it. So it helps us validate that, that everything's in spec before we integrate it into the system. Now I'm going to hit cancel here because I've already created an integration for this. It's right here. But the next step would be, so that would be creating an integration model, and from the model, so that's the definition. And then you would create an instantiation, which we just call an integration. And so to do an integration, that's where you would define things like, what is the URL? Is it HTTP, HTTPS, what port, what authentication methods, things like that. So we have the integration model. And one of the things that you'll see here is if I click on the integration model that that I've onboarded, you'll see, just like we saw in the NetBox URL, all of those API definitions
Would you look
also
at that?
available here. Yeah. So all that's available. So that's the integration. So that's how we want to make it really quickly, a quick way for our customers to integrate whatever it is, right? So in NetBox in particular here, but it could be anything with an open API, Swagger, Postman collection, and even if it uses some older like SOAP, things like that, there's still a way to create an integration or an adapter for it. But by far, the easiest way is just like I
Wow,
showed
that's
you.
pretty slick. I mean, it even looks like the Swagger site.
Right, right. Okay, so let's now move on and go into where we actually build automations in our platform. So we call that Automation Studio. And I'll create a new workflow here. I'm going to call it NW for NetBox Webinar 1. We have a couple of different ways to visualize our automations. I'm going to keep it with Gen 1 because it's a little easier for me to explain, especially because it's a little color coded. But let's start off really simple. Let's start off really basic. Let's start off with automating, a task of
This
allocating
is
an IP
super
address.
simple, but I love the fact that when you've got that loaded up there, that it shows you start and end. Like I don't know who made that
Thank
decision
you.
at what point in time, but it makes a lot of sense, and I love the way that it just pops with the start and the end automatically. Yeah.
Engineers.
Sorry, I didn't mean to pause you for something like
No,
that.
that's okay. That's okay. All right. So this is this is an older version of NetBox. It's like 2.11. We're running internally on our demo platform. So it's going to look a little different from the latest versions, the 3.2, 3.3. But generally, it's the same process, right? How do I manually grab an IP address? Well, I click this button, right? And stop me if I'm doing this wrong. But then I have all these fields available to me to fill out, and I think this
Yes.
one's required. Perhaps I know it is from it's a drop down, so you kind of have to put something in there. But I know from an API perspective, it is a required field. Status, and then you have all these available fields depending on how built out your underlying databases are, those kind of things. But in our demonstration, I'm only going to really access two fields, the status and the description. And then if I just create bing, bang, boom, I get my IP address, right? Let's see. I should go back to here. And there we go. We were allocated 10.4.1.2, right? So let's automate that. Let's automate that one-step process of what we did. Because again, automating the network change, very important. That's usually the first thing, but where does the data come from before I can even make the change?
Okay.
So that's what we'll do. So going back to our workflow with our start and end, recall, Jordan, when I said, hey, when we onboarded NetBox, so my existing NetBox adapter, and now here's that NetBox 3.2 integration that we did. So they're both available. And I like to think of this as kind of like a palette of, of options that I can drag into a canvas. Along with everything else that's been onboarded into the system appears on this right side. So everything becomes available. So whether it's a network, device, chain, or network controller, orchestrator, or if it's an IT system, if you've integrated into the system, all of their APIs that were exposed become available here, as well as a number of
Right.
system
So I have a
calls
question
that
for
are
you on this
available here.
screen. So you've got your
Sure.
instance in there, and then you've got the NetBox 3.2 that you brought in. So I
Right.
think, and I want to make sure I'm tracking this right, that could be useful. And I think I'm sort of self answering this as I'm talking it through, but in an instance where you do have multiple versions. So your internal demo, I think I saw it was on 2.11, and then current
Correct.
is 3.3. But yeah, but we've
3.3.
got you on
Yeah.
3.2 for right now. So does that make sense to have something like that if there's a change in the API? so that like if you need to test against,
Um,
so you've got your prod version,
oh,
and then
absolutely.
so an
Yeah.
example in 3.3, there's a change to the device height. So in older
Hmm.
versions, the device, like we're talking like the actual rack units, like it's a 4U SAN
Yeah.
device.
Yeah.
In the older versions, it was an integer, and then in 3.3, you can do half rack heights. So now it's a decimal, so that you can model that half U. So that's just one example, but you could, in theory, have the different versions in here for testing whatever your workflows are.
Absolutely. And we have customers doing that quite a bit, because I'll take ServiceNow as an example. Like they make a lot of development changes and development versions available. So our customers are saying, hey, we're on ServiceNow version X, but we know version Y is down the road. How can we onboard the development system so that our automations, when that switchover is, is incumbent that we have to make that switchover, that our automations still function properly, and they do that quite a bit. In fact, another use case could also be not just for testing, across different versions, but running two concurrently live. Imagine, like, for example, here we're running 2.11, but what if we were a company that just acquired some
Right.
other company, right? And they're running an older version or a newer version. And we haven't quite got to the point where maybe we're combining everything into one NetBox installation. But now you can have both of them be active and useful as a source of truth for your automations for those different parts of the network until you get to that point where you can combine them. So having all of that functionality and that flexibility to have different versions, whether it's testing development or getting ready for an upgrade, or
Right.
even because you have to in that moment, yeah, all of
Very
that's
cool.
available
All right.
here.
I like that. I like that ability to be able to sort of switch between for whatever your need is. If it's development, if it's a change in the API, that you have that flexibility. That's
Mm-hmm.
nice.
Great, great. All right, so let's automate that one task really quick. So I'm gonna leverage, because you saw how many IPAM, I mean how many API calls there were. I'm just gonna do a quick search, um, and pull in I know there's a lot of data here, but pull in a API call. So this is an API call against 2.11. Again, this is what we're running internally. It All of this summary and information comes from the documentation. That's why there's so much of it. It gives you a good hint of what that task does. Um, I just like to rename it IP address. That seems
Yeah.
pretty straightforward. Oops. Here's the adapter we're using. We actually have two versions here, so I can select which version I want. We're using this latest one here. And now, to your point earlier, it's going to have some required information here that it's asking me for. Again, this comes from the API documentation itself. It's asking for an ID, which is a type number, right? And then something called a variable called data, which is an object. And again, everything in our platform, if it says object, we're talking about JSON object, because we're using that central as a central way of representing data. Um, and so this is incoming information. So this is information that we need for this API call. Now we have a couple of options. Right now, we're just going to statically define it, meaning we're going to define it right here in this field. And so I'll show you where these numbers come from, but you probably can already guess, right? I'm defining a prefix number, an ID, and that comes from, let me go back to my NetBox here. I think it's a little different place. I think it's up here
Yeah.
in the corner in the 3.3, but for 2.11, it's right here. So this particular prefix that's been defined in our NetBox system has been given a unique identifier, right? 63. And that's what I want to reference. And I guess that's important because that has to be unique, uh, because you want to make sure you're referencing the right subnet, right, for the right allocation for that part
Yeah,
of
absolutely,
the network.
because it does exist within NetBox the ability to have different VRFs, different VRFs set up, and then you can within those enforce overlapping space, like you're allowed to or you're not allowed to. So let's say that same
Right.
subnet was available in a different routing environment. They both need to be addressable, and that's good that we can see it by the ID.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where that data comes from. So that's perfect. So just as long as we're, in your automation, this could be done programmatically, but for our purposes, I'm saying this is the subnet we need to pull information, pull an IP from. This data object right here is a JSON object. Now, the data itself that belongs in here are the definable fields that we looked at in our, in our drop down. So if I come into here, those definable fields of let's see, if I go back one, of description and status. So again, in the API documentation, it tells you which one of how to set these certain fields and functions. Um, And so here I'm just going to define them. And again, we represent everything as a JSON object. So I could do something like this, status active, and this is going to get passed into the API call. Um,
So you do still have to understand, I don't want to say programming, but you do have to understand data types and a bit of how things get passed around.
Absolutely.
It's not going to do everything for you.
It doesn't do everything for you. That's correct. You still have to understand some of that underlying information because not all of this is
Right.
necessarily defined within the API spec, right? It may say, hey, there's certain fields and they have to be set to certain strings and things like that, but um, or
Right.
they have to be certain types, but it may not necessarily give you all of the function and options that are available. So that's something you still have to do. And again, I think just understanding JSON schema, and how to represent data along with the application's documentation really gives you everything you need to know, especially if that
Yeah.
documentation helps
Yeah.
with
Yeah. And that,
examples.
that does exist within theirs. You can see examples. Yeah.
Oh, it definitely does. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to take those favorite start and
Nice.
end boxes and I'm just going to draw transitions to them
All right.
just like that. And so that's basically it. And we can run this and test it from here. And we can view the job. And we have a visualization here that allows us to see it. So what we've done is we've created a workflow, one step, pulling an IP address. That one step is basically what we did manually. If I click into it, this is run. So it gives me some specs on how it's run. But data in, I'm always saying data in, data out, right? Or data in transforming data and data out is what we'll get to in a minute. This is the data we put in, right? So the API call requires something called an ID. It's a number 63, which matches with the prefix that I'm pulling an IP from. And then the data itself is I can pass as an object, and it's going to set these values as it allocates an IP address. And so now we can see the data that was given back to us from the NetBox instance. And so basically it's saying, and you see all this data that comes. We're gonna extract what we need in a moment, but the data that's returned basically saying, "Yep, I'm going to give you this IP address with a whole bunch of other stuff that we really are important, but maybe not necessary for the
Right.
automation that we're building."
Yeah. Not for this specific, but depending on what you're doing, it could be. Yeah.
Correct. Correct. And we refresh and we'll see, there we
Huh.
go. And it set it as active. So that JSON, so I set field status as active, description as webinar, and that's what it set
Wow.
for us.
That, yeah. I mean,
So it's pretty straightforward, right? Just
yeah. I
automating
mean,
that bit.
it was,
Okay.
it worked. That was really cool. I mean, I didn't think that it wouldn't work, but just to watch it, like, just, hey, it just worked. And now you can stack other stuff.
Correct. Correct. So let's say we talked about that data uh, returning a lot of information that we didn't necessarily need at the time, right? In fact, I'll run it one more time because I want to pull that data. We'll use it in this next step. So we'll run it again. It's just going to give us the next
Right.
IP address, which is fine. But let's take a look at that data that was passed back to us from the API call into NetBox. So what we wanted, obviously, it's going to give us the next IP address there. So let's talk about the transformation piece of it. So now, how do we extract just the IP address? Because if I want to make a network change, I just want to extract the IP address and maybe pass that to another task that does the network change itself. And so we do that by doing a data transformation. So if I go to this area here, let's see, let me duplicate this, get a new tab. And you'll see we have this section here called transformations, another feature of our platform. I can create a new transformation, and we'll call this, and let's see. Okay, so here's another canvas. So this is where we do our data transformations. And again, everything is represented as JSON. So we're going to define a schema for data coming in. So going back to our automation, let's go back to this view right here. The data coming out of this is going to enter into another step. That's the transformation task for data coming into it. So that's what we're going to create here. So we have to define an incoming schema. And so one of the clever things we've done is to be able to infer it from the actual data that gets passed to us from that NetBox API call. So this was the data that from a live call that we received. I copied it, and if I go back to my transformation canvas here, I can paste that JSON data here. So that's the payload that came back from that particular API call. And if I click on infer schema, it creates the definition based off of what it finds here for me. So this is a really useful thing because this is a lot of information. Of course, it's it's documented in the API specs for sure, but this is kind of a shortcut for not having to build it by hand, because this is something you're going to do all the time when you're doing API calls between systems or network controllers, things like that. So I'm just going to, the only thing I need to do here is to now give it a unique name as an ID. So I'm just going to say get IP address. And now you'll see the schema was created here, or the definition was created based off of that schema. And now it allows us to map data into our outgoing schema. So this is the transformation. So this is data in, this is going to be data out, and the transformation piece happens here in this part of the canvas. So the one thing that we really are interested in is this address. It's a string. So if I go over here and click that, it's going to map that data out. So I'm just going to extract out of all the data that gets returned. I'm going to extract that one piece because that's what I need. So we can test it here. This isn't a live run. And because we inferred from a live, from a live payload, the schema saves the live data as a payload for testing. So it's built into the schema that it inferred. So it allows us to test by generating that using the live data as sample inputs. And if I run, it's going to give me the output. So given that data that matches the schema, and I map that out to the address, this is the output that it gives me, which is the IP address that should map to the IP address from the next live API call that we use this transformation on. There is one issue here, is that I really only need this, right? I don't want this piece of it because this is going to be a Cisco device, and the /24 is Cisco iOS device is not something I don't want. So this is where the data transformation comes in. So let's do this. Let's remove that, and let's go into this area here. So here's another kind of like canvas set of data manipulation tools. And if you come from a background where you do have some JavaScript or even Python background, these things typically you would have to write code for, strings, right? But we've created a module.
I'm sorry. Are we going to slice some strings?
We are going to, we are going to.
Slice,
let's see.
split,
we could. Yeah, we could do that. We could do a split here. Let's see.
Oh.
So we could do a split. Pull this address. So that becomes the source. The separator. We get a little help here. It tells us the separator is another string. So that's the slash, right? And that's going to turn it into an array. So it's going to give us two strings. Basically, one will be the IP address, right? In the example 10414. The second will be the second string in the array will be 24. We really only want the first one. So we can have an array manipulator here, and we can say, get the index of it. So now I can map the array that comes out of this to here. And now I can specify the array index of 0, which is the first element. And because this will change the type to whatever output you define here, that should
Okay,
be all
so
we need.
split on the slash and then just take the so you definitely have to understand programming logic. Like you have to understand that a
Yes.
split is a thing. 'Cause I can't count the number of times where I put like very early in my programming journey, which is still very rudimentary to be honest. But like, how do I separate a string given at a character or something like that, and then and land
Correct.
on expert exchange and get some help from there. So you do have to
Hmm.
understand some of that. Is there like knowledge in here that can help you learn some of that, or do you guys have training that can help?
We have a ton of training, and every one of these methods, you click here, it takes you to very in-depth documentation about how that particular function is used. Here's the good news is once you learn the base functions, you're pretty much
Right.
using those all the time for these kinds of features and extracting data. But yeah, and again, think through, if I'm pulling something out from a database or a spreadsheet or even NetBox's GUI front end, I am doing some data manipulation manually. Now it's just mapping the right functions to the things I already inherently know foundationally to figure out how to extract those things. But yeah, there is certainly the need to understand these. And by the way, like if you already know regular expression, you can do regular expressions,
I love
right?
regex.
There's all kinds of different functions here to do it. But the key point about this is to make it very, very simple for anybody to do it once they
That's
understand the
phenomenal.
underlying features and functions. Yeah. So it's JSON and some data manipulation to do the transformations, and then being able to map that back out to the output. So we can save it, we can test it, we can run it, and now we can see, yep, we're getting the one thing that we needed, which is just the IP address. So that's part of creating a transformation. So let's go back to the canvas. Let's see. Which one? There we go. And now let's add that transformation task to this. It's easier because there's, as you add more integrations, you're going to have more and more things there. So it's easy to do a search. So here's a transformation task. I'll insert it into the data flow here. Give it a new name. Well, let's do this. Let's search for transformations. Let's see. This is the one we've created. Okay, so remember we created the incoming
Yep.
schema called get IP address. So it pulls that from the transformation, and it's basically saying, okay, where does that data come from? You defined an incoming schema, but where does the actual data come from? We've showed earlier we can statically define things, so I could create a JSON object to match that. But really, we want to get that data from a previous task that ran, and in that case, it's the get IP address, which is the API call to NetBox. So then it says, okay, I understand that there was that call. You've selected it. It returns the value of that API call into this variable called result, and I'll use that as the input.
Okay. Makes sense.
So now, yep. So the data. So we statically put data into this for the incoming. It's going to give us the outgoing. That schema matches here, and now it should transform that data into the one thing that we're looking for, at least for right now.
Yeah, and I can see like if you're familiar with programming, like if you're comfortable with jumping in and putting your own Python script together, like obviously, maybe it's not obvious, but it would be easier like just within the Python to do it something like that on your own because that's like basically one
Mhm.
string or one line to do that. But when you're putting it
Right.
in a low code platform like this, I mean, I suppose there's more clicks involved, but it does if this is your approach, it's going to lend to you being able to build something much more robust because you don't have to understand programming that deeply. Like you're not generating that that source code on your
Right.
own.
Yeah, there's also this so it's more approachable by more people is what
Right. Yeah.
we would hope, right? Versus writing code. We're not saying you shouldn't write code, but in the world of network automation, that's probably been one of the biggest hurdles to overcome is the fact
Right.
that, hey, go learn Python and then go learn Python
Right.
and the libraries you need and do it correctly. And then when somebody actually goes down that route, how many other people can look at the work and
That's
understand
a
what's going
very
on?
good point.
So it's very difficult. So at least, and I'll show you in a moment that we actually love the fact that organizations do have these kind of automation assets because we can leverage them in the platform. They become another block that you drop into the workflow, and that's somebody's Python code, and I'll show that in a minute. So remember our transformation. So we just did a live call so we got the NetBox, so we got the next IP, which is .5. We're really burning through some
Gonna
IPs
use
here.
them all up.
Yeah, but our transformation said, how do we extract just what we need? And now the output of that transformation call gives us exactly what we need here. So that's the concept of incoming data, defining it in a schema, passing it from a previous step, transforming it so that it can be used for something else later on in the automation. All right, so now we've done all of that good stuff. Let's go make a network change. Let's do that. All right. So I actually have a Python script called mycreateloopback.py. This is actually a Python script that just does that. It just uses NetMiko, which is a package library that in Python that can do CLI configurations on devices. You pass it some data. In this case, we'll show you what the data is that we pass. Given that the data is correct, in the correct format, then it will go and make that change. This is a great example of, hey, you know what? Jordan has written all these great scripts in Python to make changes on the network. How can we leverage all that? This is how we do it. We can take that Python work, Ansible, pretty much anything, honestly. If you can run it, in a Linux environment, you can pretty much leverage it in our platform as well. And it becomes, again, we kind of normalize everything. So whether it's an API call, whether it's a transformation operation, which is what this purple thing is an operation, or whether it's an actual script, we try to normalize everything into steps.
So is your use of NetMiko in here, is that, I'm trying to think the right way to ask this question. So there are still definitely places where, and I think we've touched on this a couple times, where you still have to have some understanding outside of just Itential, like the platform itself. That's because I'm familiar with NetMiko. I've played with it, and now we're referencing a script that also uses NetMiko.
Right.
But that's not the only way through, right? Like okay, this is just the way that you've put together that makes sense for the demo and for this.
Yeah. Actually, I'll tell you how we came about this. This was a script that we grabbed from Cisco DevNet. So somebody else at Cisco wrote it, and we thought, hey, there's probably a lot of organizations that have this somewhere, and they may actually be using it, right? And so their decision to make when they made the script is, hey, let's go leverage NetMiko. Right. But it could be leveraging some other package. We're agnostic to that. If your script works and it uses the tooling and the libraries and the packages that you're familiar with, that's great. We can turn that into something that basically becomes, we can attach an API to it, define a JSON schema that says it must have these variables, and you're looking at those now. And as long as you can pass those variables over from other parts of your automation, we pass those to your script. It runs, it does the thing you want it to do because that's what you wrote it to do. And it gives us back the output that we can parse and determine, whether things went well or didn't go well. That's how we leverage it. Or they'll take, for example, something like an SD-WAN deployment, right? Where you have a controller that manages all of the independent devices. Well, if that controller has an API integration into our system, like they publish their APIs like NetBox does, we integrate into that. Then we can use the controller to make changes to network devices. So it's really, we try to be as agnostic as possible to whatever the tools, whether it's writing code, whether it's the different systems they have. And that's why we've chosen like that API approach to things. So we can even take your scripts and turn them into API accessible objects within our platform so that we can normalize them and use them in the canvas as well. Okay. Wow. We've got just a little bit of time and we haven't even finished the first 4 parts of this demo. So let me run you through it. But this has been a great discussion. So we may run a little bit over if that's okay, Jordan. Okay. All right. So in my code that I've written here, it's requiring 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different pieces of information, right? Hosts, which is a type of array, and then these strings: interface name, a description, an IP address, and a net mask. Well, we've already generated the IP address from our transformation, but what I want to do now is to generate the rest of this information so that it can be passed along into the actual network change itself. So that means we'll have to gather some more data. In this case, it'll be from a form. And I'll show you the form information in a minute. All right, so let me interject this into the workflow. So then we'll have a form here. Okay, so it's going to need a form ID, which is an ID from a form that was created in our platform, and then something called instance data. I'll save this for now, and let me show you what the form looks like. So I'm just opening a new tab here. I'm going to these forms. I've already pre-created it. It's called NW demo. So here's another canvas, Jordan, where you can actually drag and drop elements into a form. Just for time, I've kind of created a form. This is a drop down, which is an element here. We can have checkboxes. We can have text input fields. You can pre-populate them with data, so with like defaults. So in this case, I want to pre-populate it with loopback 301 on this particular router. I can limit, which routers are available through a drop down, those kind of things. The cool thing is, once we've created the form, I can preview it from here. I can actually enter some data into here. And then if I show form data, it's going to actually show me the JSON object that it would normally return when it's run. So this, again, is useful because now I can go back into my transformation and recall we created one data source, right? This was from the NetBox. Now I can take a data source that is a form, and the data that is returned from that form can now go into this transformation. So I could have multiple sources of information for my incoming schemas. So for instance, we'll go through the same process here. That came from the preview on the form. So that's data that it would normally output. I can create the schema here, and I can say this ID is from form data. Save it, and now that becomes another source here that I can start mapping to. Let's see. So we need a couple more things here. I think we need an address. We need a net mask. So here's an interesting one. I know I can create these statically here, so I can call this net mask. So this is another outgoing schema. We're just going to type this as a string. So it's going to create another entry here. And because this is a loopback, and the policy of our network is to always have loopbacks with 255, 255, 255, 255, I can set this statically by creating a new string. Oops. Populating it with that value and just mapping it over.
So just like that. It.
So that's 205. Here's something cool. Since interface name is already a string, and that's what it really needs to be when we pass it over to the script, the change script, the network change script, I can just map that directly over. And I know this is looking a little confusing with all the stuff. I'll try to make it pretty here. There we go. Description, same thing. It's a script. It's a string, so I don't need to transform the data at all. But I do need to transform this router name. And the reason why, if we go back to the script here, the router name is really called the host variable. That's defined when I onboarded the script in another place in our platform, but it's an array, not a string. Because the script can actually iterate over multiple hosts. So you could do the same change over multiple hosts. You wouldn't want to do it here, but you could build a script that could do that, right? Like setting SNMP parameters so they all match across all your different, routers in a particular area. That's always a good idea. Or time server,
Right.
right?
Or
NTP
syslog or
or syslog. Exactly. So that's why that's there. So we need to change that. So we do need to do a data transformation here and change string to an array, even though it's a one element array. So I can, similar to creating a new string, I can create a new array. I can map that as an element. Of course, since an array has multiple elements, you can add multiple elements to it. In this case, don't need to. And then I'll just create a new outgoing schema called hosts. I'm going to lowercase it. Type array. Save it. And then I can go map from here to there, just like that. All right, so that should be everything. We can test it here. And now, based off of our outgoing schemas, this is the data in a JSON object that it's going to output. And everything looks good there. We've got our IP address, our net mask, our loopback interface, our description for the port, and then the device we want to actually make the change on. So now we've transformed that data from two different sources, done a little data manipulation, and we can go back into our automation. Let me do one thing here. When you make a change to a transformation, you should refresh it because we added a bunch of new stuff. So if I refresh it here, remember we created a second incoming schema. This is from the form. So now it learns that, and it's going to say, okay, where am I going to get the data from? If I'm going to manipulate this form data, where's it going to come from? It's going to get from kit form data, which is the JSON form that we added to the workflow. It automatically knows it's going to export it into a variable called export. So it's going to pre-populate that. And so that fixes that. Now we go back to our shell script. Now we can start to map those data fields from our transformation into the shell script that will make the network change. So the data transformation that we created was called NetBox Webinar Transform NetBox Data. So I'm going to use that as the reference task. And so now it automatically sees all of the outgoing schema definitions we created. So this is data out, simply data out. So now all I have to do is map one-to-one. And this is why it's nice to have like consistent naming, or at least naming that matches what your data types and variables are. So it makes it really easy. So interface name to interface name. So the script requires description. That's going to also come from my transformation. Requires an IP address. This is the first thing that we did, was extract the address. That's probably why it's first in the list there. And then netmask to netmask. All right. So we've saved that. We'll save the workflow. Let's see. Oh, and I forgot to fill the form out. Okay, so the form data is, let's see, where was the form? I know we showed the form earlier, didn't I? I think it was just NW demo. So we got to give it the name. But that's the form ID, the form we've created. And then instance data, we can set default values for the form. So you can kind of override the default values that I set for the form that we created, but I don't want to do that here. So I'm just going to leave it as an empty object, but it still requires an object. Now we should be able to run. Yep. Okay. So now let's do our little 4-step process here. So notice here, the first thing it's going to do is it's asking us to take a look at that form, right? Form is a manual process. If we go to visualize here, anytime you see a blue box in this visualization, it means it's a manual step. So you have to manually go in. And of course, we're manually entering form data. So you have to go to this work task, and it'll pop up the form. So this is the form we created that was already created. So we're going to determine this is the device, this is the interface name, this is the description for the new interface, for the loopback interface. I click confirm. It's going to move forward in that task. It's going from here. It went to the NetBox that got the new IP address. We did the transformation. We can take a look at that real quick. So that was the transformation of all the data that it pulled, right? So our first source was the form, which it got all of this data from. Our second source was the NetBox API call. So it's got the new IP address here. We've defined the net mask in the transformation. So it's pulled all that. And then that becomes the input for here.
Okay.
So that it can run the script with the appropriate inputs. And then the outgoing is the data that came back from the script. In this case, success. We can see that it's a success here. And you can build more logic to trap the success and error, of the script. Usually we would refer to that like as in a post check process, just like you would if you were doing something manually on the CLI. Like, I just typed this thing in. Did it actually create the interface?
Right.
Let me go back and check. Being able to do those things is definitely part of the platform. Being able to going back and do that logic and checking and rolling back or rerunning things again, or even opening up a ticket, for somebody to take a look at. But for sake of simplicity, like we kept it pretty straightforward. And so that's it. So here's two sources, right? NetBox being the primary for IP address. This data that came from the form could easily have come from NetBox, being able to manipulate the data and then pass it along to actually a Python script, or it could be any other API task call to, a controller or network controller orchestrator to actually make a change to the network.
That's really cool.
And, just because we're engineers, we want to prove
let's see that it worked.
So here's the device, Core ATL0, which is the device we made. And then here's
there it is.
Loopback 301 hello world description. And there's the IP that we pulled from NetBox. There you go. There's the last one.
Is this why we're running
right.
out of IP4 addresses? Because we just keep running demos like this?
Hey, I maybe. No one will admit or deny to overuse of IP addressing. All right. So last thing, Jordan, is we talked about being able to get NetBox, an IP address from NetBox, transform it to use it for a network change. But the thing I always like to remind folks of when they, especially as they're building automations in our platform, is that information from a source can be used in multiple, it doesn't have to be used just in a network change task. It can be used other places. And a great example that we always run into is ServiceNow. So I'll show you how we can leverage the same information we got from the NetBox call to now be used for an update in ServiceNow. So let me pull up a workflow that I've already built here. Okay. So you see these 4 steps here? They should look familiar. This is exactly what we just did. The only thing I did was I added on ServiceNow calls in another transformation in another pause so that we can verify the data. But the same way we just pulled a task from the NetBox integration that we have, that API call for the NetBox adapter there to pull an IP address. Once I understand the necessary calls for an application like ServiceNow, and they're pretty straightforward, right? Create change request is one of the API calls. I can simply drag and drop that back in to here and start leveraging it the same way. So creating a change request is very similar to requesting an IP address from NetBox, in the sense that it's a task that I dropped in and I'm filling out some basic information, right? The only thing it requires, based off of the documentation from ServiceNow, this is where I pulled this information from, is I need the very least a summary of what this, of a field. It's called the short description in a ServiceNow ticket. And if I have that, it'll allow me to create a new change request ticket. The output of this call now is going to be a lot of data, just kind of like the NetBox call, right? It's going to give me a lot of data, but the one thing I'm really interested in is the new change request ID, which is a unique identifier. Just like there was a unique IP address from the NetBox adapter for the change request, I need that unique ID because I want to update that later, which gets used here. So just like what we did with the NetBox adapter and the transformation here, I created a transformation that just extracts that string, which is the new change request ID, so that it can be used here. So if I double click this is the update change request ticket. The update change request ticket has two variables that it requires. One of them is this ServiceNow ID, which comes from this transformation. Look here, transform data from ServiceNow. That's this transformation. And also required is a body, which is another JSON object that says, hey, what fields do you want to update? So it's very similar to when we created the JSON, the static JSON that said status, active, description, and then a free-form description. Similar to that is the API call that's required for ServiceNow to update a ticket. And that's coming from this transform data from NetBox. So this is something I added to this particular transformation so that it can generate a JSON object that can now be used within this call in ServiceNow. So I'm taking the data, and so I'm going to show you in a moment the notes that we created that uses the IP address that we get from NetBox. So now this transformation has another layer of input and another layer of output, input scheme and output, so that it can address updating ServiceNow. And then finally, we'll stop the automation here. It's a blue box, so it will stop the automation, and then we'll take a look at all of the different things going on in ServiceNow, and then we'll close the ticket out as this last step. So again, you can start here from those four basic functions of getting that an IP address and making a change. So getting that IP from NetBox, making a change, and then over time, as you get more acquainted with API calls specific to different platforms, generally populating variables, data manipulations, then it's adding this layer right here, right, to expand that automation. So let's run it. All right. So visualize it again. So here we go. We created that ServiceNow request. So this is data we populated statically. Here's that ID that it returned. That's the thing we mostly want to get out of this, because our transformation is going to extract that. So here's all that ServiceNow data that came from the single API call, but we're now extracting that one variable. So that's the transformation, very similar to what we've already done. Okay, so now I've got a form. So this is the exact same form that we've used before. So now we're back on track to our original 4 tasks that we created earlier. So now that was one source of data. That's going to also pull from NetBox to get the next IP address. Doing the transformation. So not only it makes the change, this is what we did earlier in the earlier workflow, but now there's an additional step in the transformation to update the ServiceNow ticket. And now we're going to stop here to verify changes. So it stopped the workflow. So now we can go into ServiceNow and take a look at a couple of things that were going on. So here's the ServiceNow change requests. So these are all the active change requests. I'll refresh it here. And here's our new one, new network loopback interface. So that's those are the ServiceNow calls, API calls that we made. It's in state review. So whenever you create something new, it's state new. But in our update, we moved it to review because it has to follow a very precise, policy procedure before you can close a ticket out. But just as an example of how we can change and manipulate those things from an automation. And again, all of this is available through the standard API calls in ServiceNow. The one key component here is under notes, right? This is where we're always missing the ability to update. We're just forgetting, right? In the middle of a 3 a.m. Maintenance window, we're doing a bunch of stuff to get the work done. And unfortunately, a lot of times we forget to update the tickets so that if there's a problem for the next shift of engineers, those poor guys are going to have to go through and figure out what's going on, where it would have been really helpful to document what you've done.
Yeah.
So that's what we've done here. So we opened the ticket in the beginning of that workflow. The state was new. We updated to review. And then this is what we've added. So in that transformation, I added to it the information to update this ticket in ServiceNow. We formatted that data, and this is the data that came from NetBox, right? So that's how, when you take a look at it, the concept of data in, transformation, data out is relevant across not just a source like NetBox to a network change, but it can be relevant to any number of IT systems. The other one that always pops up is like your messaging and notification system. If you're using MS Teams or Slack, being able to take the same data and then pushing it out to a Slack channel to let all the network team members know, hey, this just happened. All right. So now we saw that. Let's go back to our job manager. If I go to manual tasks, I can work that task again. That was a pause in the flow. It didn't necessarily have to be there. I hit continue, and it will now close out the ticket. We can see everything's completed and it's finished the automation. If we go over here, let's see, back to this. Should be able to refresh, and the state should go back to close. There it is. And the note should be closed. There it is. Yep.
And there it is.
Well, yep. .7 was the last one. And then we'll check again, just because we're engineers.
Of course.
Yeah, we want to make sure.
There it is.
Here we go. Hi, Jordan, 10417. That's it. All right. So just to recap, I mean, if we take a look at the automation, we've covered a lot of ground for sure. Let's see. Let me get to the right one. This will work. We started off with just these four, really just the NetBox getting an IP address, reserving an IP address, but adding to it another source of truth. And by the way, Jordan, we do have that 3.2 version onboarded here as well, right? So if I go to the automation, let's see, where's the workflow? Here we go. Here's the actual workflow on the canvas. If I wanted, so this is actually leveraging the 2.11 adapter that we have here. If I wanted to update this to use 3.2, really all I have to do is swap out. I could clone this entire workflow, keep the same logic and everything, and just change out this and potentially these two pieces right here. The API call, if it's different, right? And the transformation, if it has a different format for data. I make those two changes and everything else ought to stay.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that really gets back to that question that I asked earlier about the differences within the APIs between versions. That is, you have to know the flows, right? You have to be able to programmatically think through any of these processes that you're trying to put together. But the fact that it becomes so repeatable and somebody else can run it, and it's sort of, I don't want to say that it self-documents, but it's easier to follow than like a bunch of my comments in some Python file or some Python script that I hacked together.
If you're lucky to get comments at all.
It's usually a bunch of breaks.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. And let me also point out a couple other things. These transformations that we create are reusable. They're not just allocated to one workflow. They can be used in multiple workflows. So number one, so the work that gets done, if it's this is work that is repeatable, the workflows, I mean, the transformations get done, can be reused, but also you could also create workflows, like a standalone workflow that does something generally like get an IP address. And in the workflow, it can be called as a child workflow, or kind of as a subroutine, if you will. And so that you can start to create more reusable assets within our platform, so that if you do have to make a change, right, to the underlying NetBox, you're going from 2.11 to 3.2 or 3.3. If all of your workflows are using a child workflow, like a generic child workflow that you've created called, get IP address, then you can make those changes in one place, and all of your workflows that you've created, or the teams that are creating, will automatically get the changes and the updates, because you're just updating in one place. So that makes it a little easier to even manage those kind of changes versus code, especially if it's code that's in every single program that you have to update.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you. I know we've run late. I know we've run over, but I mean, the dialogue was definitely worth it. Again, one of my focuses for this was to show how you can automate NetBox in a very fundamental way. We can certainly break that open to a lot of other stuff, and we're certainly open to having further dialogues, webinars, and demonstrations around some of the other functionality around NetBox. We think that's really, really cool to explore. But hopefully I helped you to understand how to operate in the environment
Yeah,
too and build
absolutely, and
automations.
I'm glad that I came into this, knowing as little as I did about Itential, because now now I have a growing list of questions. So the idea that maybe we can do more of these is really appealing. I absolutely love it.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, Jordan, thank you so much. Audience, thank you so much. I know we ran a little bit over or a lot of bit over, but for those that stuck around, we really appreciate your time. And again, Jordan, look, this was awesome to work with you. Look forward to more with you in the future. And I'll say goodbye and I'll let
Yeah,
you say goodbye as well,
thanks
Jordan.
everyone who tuned in for this. It was really fun to again come in not knowing and not a lot and learn here. I definitely see a lot of use cases out there. But yeah, I don't have too much more to say than that.
Awesome. Well, thank
Take
you
care.
very much. Take care.